I watched a man pray for 17 hours straight. His knees had fused to the stone floor. The blood pooling beneath him had gone cold hours ago, but he never stopped whispering the emperor's name. When the ecclesiarchy priests finally dragged him away, his legs shattered like glass. They threw what was left of him into the corpse furnaces that keep the shrine world of Ophelia 7 warm during the winter months. That was the moment I stopped believing in the God Emperor of mankind. But I'm getting ahead of myself. They tell you the Imperium is holy. They show you the Golden Throne, the mighty space marines, the billions of souls united in faith across a million worlds. They speak of humanity's last bastion against the darkness, of the Emperor's eternal protection, of sacrifice and service and the nobility of dying for something greater than yourself. And if you're lucky, if you're born in the right sector, on the right world, to the right family, you might live your entire life believing those beautiful lies. I was born on Krieg. Yes, that Krieg. The death world where children are taught to load a lost gun before they learn to read. Where every citizen is born with a debt of blood to pay for the sins of ancestors who betrayed the Imperium 10,000 years ago. We don't have names on Krieg, not real ones. Just designations, numbers that track our lineage and our purpose. I was Krieger 5743 Delta 88, and I was bred for exactly one thing: to die in the Emperor's service, and to die well. The hab blocks where I grew up were carved into the bedrock 3 kilometers below the planet's poisoned surface. 20,000 of us in my generational cohort, all born within the same cycle year, all raised in identical dormitories where the temperature never rose above freezing and the recycled air tasted of chemicals and death. We slept in stacked bunks, 60 children to a room, and when one of us died from the cold or the toxins or the daily punishments for insufficient dedication, we simply compressed the bodies in the industrial processors and continued with our training. I was 6 years old when I first killed someone. Another child, designation 5743, Delta 102, who had stolen an extra ration cube during the midday feeding. The punishment for theft was immediate execution, and I was selected to carry it out because my marksmanship scores were highest in our cohort. They gave me a stub pistol and marched us all out to the training yard. The other child knelt in the center, hands bound, face covered by the standard issue rebreather that all Kriegers wore constantly. I remember wondering if it was a boy or a girl beneath that mask. I never found out. I put the barrel against the back of their head and pulled the trigger, and the body fell forward into the frozen mud, and we all filed back inside for afternoon weapons drill. I felt nothing. That was the point. Kriegers don't feel. We serve. We obey. We die. Emotion is weakness, and weakness is betrayal of the debt we owe. Every single one of us is born guilty, tainted by the rebellion that turned our world into a radioactive hellscape, and we spend our entire lives trying to earn forgiveness through blood and suffering. It's not cruelty, it's mathematics. 10 billion Kriegers have died in the Emperor's wars since the rebellion was crushed, and the debt is still not paid. So we keep dying generation after generation, marching into gunfire with the same mindless determination as servitors, except we're supposed to feel honored by the privilege. The training intensified as we aged. By 10, we could field strip a lost gun blindfolded in under 40 seconds. By 12, we could march for 20 hours straight carrying full combat loads without food or water. By 14, we were proficient in siege warfare, trench combat, chemical weapon deployment, and the correct procedures for processing our own fallen into nutrient paste to feed the next wave of soldiers. The instructors never praised us. They never needed to. We knew what we were for. We were ammunition. We were expendable. And we were proud of it because pride was the only emotion we were permitted to feel. I was 16 when the selection happened. The Officio Perfectus arrived on Krieg to recruit for something different, something that required more than just the ability to absorb bullets. They were looking for Kriegers who could think, who could observe and report and analyze. Not commissars exactly, but something adjacent to them. Political officers who would be embedded in Imperial Guard regiments to monitor loyalty, to document heresy, to ensure that the Emperor's soldiers maintained proper faith even in the face of horrors that would break lesser men. It was considered an honor. Most Kriegers died in their first engagement, often within hours of deployment. These selected few might survive for years, might witness dozens of campaigns, might actually make a measurable difference in the Imperium's endless wars. I was chosen. I don't know why. My scores were acceptable but not exceptional. I had never shown initiative or creativity, qualities that would have been punished anyway. But when the Prefectus representatives reviewed our cohort, they pointed at me and 4 others, and we were separated from the group and taken to a different facility where the real education began. They taught us to read and write, not just in Low Gothic but in High Gothic and several Xenos languages that the Imperium had catalogued. They taught us Imperial history, the approved version, where every event led inexorably to humanity's righteous dominion over the galaxy and the Emperor's ascension to godhood. They taught us the 1,000 subtle signs of heresy, how to identify chaos corruption in its earliest stages, how to recognize Xeno's influence and gene-stealer infiltration and the dangerous ideas that led to rebellion against the Imperium's benevolent rule. And they taught us to lie, to smile, to pretend to be something other than what we were. Because a Krieger in full uniform and rebreather was too obvious, too intimidating. We needed to blend in, to move through normal Imperial society without triggering suspicion, to be invisible observers who documented everything and reported it to our superiors in the Officio Prefectus. The augmentations came next. Nothing as extreme as what the Mechanicus did to their own, but enough to make us useful. Subdermal communication implants that let us send encrypted reports without speaking. Optical enhancements that allowed us to record everything we saw. Auditory filters that could pick out specific conversations in crowded rooms. Metabolic modifications that let us survive on minimal food and water for extended periods. They stripped away the few remaining biological limitations that might have made us vulnerable, and they replaced them with machinery that served the Emperor's purposes. I should have felt violated. I should have felt fear or anger or some recognition that my body was being taken from me without consent. But Kriegers don't have concepts like bodily autonomy or personal choice. We belonged to the Imperium from the moment of our birth. Our bodies were just tools, no different from the lost guns we carried or the entrenching equipment we used to dig our own graves before battles. If the Emperor required that we be modified, then modification was what we would accept. The final stage of training took place off-world. They shipped the 5 of us to a facility on some nameless moon where the Officio Prefectus maintained their indoctrination centers. It was there that I first encountered people from other worlds, soldiers and administrators and priests who had never known the crushing weight of Krieg's perpetual guilt. They laughed. They told jokes. They complained about the food and the accommodations and the tedious nature of their duties. It was incomprehensible to me. How could they function without the structure of absolute obedience? How did they motivate themselves without the debt hanging over them like a suspended blade? I asked one of the instructors this question during a rare moment of permitted inquiry. She was an older woman, scarred and hard-eyed, who had served as a commissar in the Sabbat World's crusade before being reassigned to training duty. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Most people don't need to be motivated by guilt, Krieger. They're motivated by hope, by the belief that their service might lead to something better, for themselves or their families or their worlds. It's not as efficient as your methods, but it's sustainable. You Kriegers burn bright and fast, but you burn out. These others, they can keep going for decades because they actually believe the Imperium cares about them. I didn't understand what she meant, not then, but I filed the information away in my memory, another data point to be analyzed later, another insight into the incomprehensible behavior of non-Kriegers. My first assignment came when I turned 18 standard years. They gave me a new designation, Perfectus Observer Talion 88, and assigned me to a regiment being assembled for deployment to the Gothic sector. The 117th Cadian Shock Troops, 12,000 soldiers drawn from one of the Imperium's most famous military worlds, veterans of a dozen campaigns who carried themselves with the confidence of professional killers. I was supposed to embed with them, to observe their conduct, to identify any signs of corruption or wavering faith, and to report directly to the Officio Perfectus with my findings. They told me I wouldn't need my rebreather anymore. Couldn't wear it, actually, because it would mark me as Krieger and make the soldiers suspicious. So for the first time in my life, I took it off. I stood in my assigned quarters on the transport ship and looked at my own face in a scratched mirror, and I had no idea what I was seeing. Pale skin from a lifetime underground. Scars from the chemical burns that were unavoidable on Krieg. Eyes that were flat and cold and empty of anything that might be mistaken for humanity. I looked like a corpse. I looked like what I was. The Cadians accepted me with the casual indifference of soldiers who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. They assumed I was just another junior commissar, too young and inexperienced to pose any real threat, someone to be tolerated until I either proved useful or got myself killed. They didn't know I was recording everything they said, every joke and complaint and moment of doubt. They didn't know that my reports could result in their execution for heresy or cowardice or insufficient faith. They treated me almost kindly, like a younger sibling who needed to be educated in the realities of war. We deployed to Varkus Prime 3 months later, a hive world in the Gothic sector that had gone silent after reports of worker uprisings in the lower levels. The Imperium needed to restore order, which meant our regiment would be dropped into the hive cities to hunt down the rebels and execute them as examples to anyone else considering defiance. It should have been routine. Hive rebellions happened constantly throughout the Imperium, usually triggered by food shortages or administrative corruption or the simple crushing weight of existence in those vertical cities where billions of people lived in conditions that made Krieg's Habblocks look comfortable by comparison. The Guard would deploy, the rebels would be slaughtered, and normalcy would resume until the next uprising. But Varkus Prime was different. The moment we descended through the atmosphere, the moment our dropships entered the hive city's airspace, I knew something was wrong. The city below wasn't dark or damaged. The lights were on. The factories were running. The transit systems continued to move in their prescribed routes. Everything looked normal except for one detail. There were no people. The streets were empty. The Habblocks showed signs of recent occupation. Meals left half-eaten. Workstations abandoned mid-shift. But the population of 17 billion souls had simply vanished. Our regiment deployed anyway. Orders were orders. We secured landing zones, established patrol routes, began systematically clearing the hive levels from top to bottom. And we found nothing. No bodies, no signs of violence, no evidence of where the people had gone. Just empty corridors that still smelled of humanity, still echoed with the ghost of voices, but contained no life whatsoever. The soldiers started to break on the third day. It wasn't the absence of an enemy that destroyed them. It was the absence of anything. We were trained to fight, to kill, to die in glorious combat. But there was nothing to fight here. Just silence and emptiness and the growing sense that something vast and incomprehensible had reached down and erased 17 billion people as casually as a human might wipe dust from a table. I documented everything. I recorded the soldiers' fear, their growing paranoia, the way they started seeing movement in shadows that held nothing. I noted the rising instances of prayer, the way even the most secular troopers began clutching prayer beads and reciting litanies to the Emperor. And I reported it all to my superiors in the Officio Perfectus, describing in clinical detail how faith was the only thing keeping these men from complete psychological collapse. We found the first shrine on the 5th day of deployment. It was located in the central plaza of Hive Level 47, a space large enough to hold 100,000 people. In the exact center, someone had constructed an altar using scavenged materials. Clothing, personal possessions, data slates, all of it arranged in careful geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. And surrounding the altar in concentric circles were markings written in what I initially thought was paint but later realized was blood. Thousands of gallons of blood, enough to drain hundreds of people, arranged in symbols that my optical implants flagged immediately as heretical, as chaos corruption, as evidence of something so fundamentally wrong that merely witnessing it represented a spiritual danger. The regiment's commissar, a man named Kraus who had served for 30 years without ever showing doubt, took one look at that shrine and shot himself in the head. Just drew his bolt pistol, put it under his chin, and pulled the trigger. His body fell across the blood patterns, and where his blood mixed with what was already there, the symbols began to glow with a sickly green light that pulsed in rhythm with heartbeats none of us could hear. The soldiers broke, not all at once, but steadily, like a dam developing cracks. Some ran, disappearing into the hive's depths and never returning. Some turned their weapons on themselves. Some turned their weapons on each other. And some just stopped moving, standing frozen in place, staring at nothing, their minds shattered by proximity to whatever presence had consumed this world. I kept recording. That was my function. Even as the regiment disintegrated around me, even as men I had fought alongside for months descended into madness or death, I maintained my observations and sent my reports. The Officio Perfectus needed to know what had happened here. They needed to understand that chaos corruption had reached a scale beyond anything in the standard threat assessment matrices. They needed this data so they could update their doctrines and prevent similar losses in the future. But somewhere around the 10th day, after watching the 117th Cadian shock troops reduce from 12,000 soldiers to fewer than 200 survivors, after documenting 17 suicides and 43 murders and countless instances of psychological breakdown, I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The Officio Perfectus already knew. They had known before we deployed. The rebellion on Varkus Prime had never been about worker uprisings. It had been chaos corruption from the start, and we had been sent here not to suppress it but to witness it, to provide data points, to serve as test subjects in an ongoing study of how rapidly chaos exposure could destroy Imperial forces. We were expendable. We had always been expendable. The only difference was that I had been arrogant enough to think my role as an observer made me special, made me something other than ammunition. But I wasn't. None of us were. The Imperium consumed us exactly the same way it consumed everyone else. The only variation was how quickly we died and how much useful data could be extracted from our deaths. I should have been horrified. I should have felt betrayed or angry or some normal human emotion in response to discovering that everything I believed was a lie. But I was Krieger. I had been trained since birth to accept that my life had no value beyond its utility to the Imperium. Learning that I was even more expendable than I had imagined should have made no difference. Except it did. For the first time in my life, I felt something that wasn't duty or obligation or the crushing weight of inherited guilt. I felt doubt, and once that crack opened in my conditioning, everything else began to pour through. We evacuated the planet on day 14. Out of 12,000 soldiers, 87 of us made it back to the transport ships. The rest were left behind, dead or insane or still wandering the empty hives, searching for an enemy that had never existed in any form we could fight. The Officio Perfectus classified the entire campaign as a strategic withdrawal, filed all relevant data in their archives, and prepared to send another regiment to Varkus Prime in 6 months to repeat the exact same process. I was commended for my service. They praised the quality of my observations, the clarity of my reports, my ability to maintain function even as the soldiers around me collapsed. They gave me a commendation that would be added to my permanent record and assigned me to another regiment deploying to another war zone where I would document another atrocity and call it duty. But I couldn't do it anymore. The conditioning that had defined my entire existence had fractured. I started seeing things I was supposed to ignore, started questioning orders I was supposed to follow without hesitation, started recognizing that the Imperium I served was not holy or noble or necessary. It was just an empire, vast and cruel and indifferent, consuming its own citizens in quantities that made individual death meaningless. I deserted. I falsified my transport orders, altered my identity in the military databases, and disappeared into the civilian populations that moved between worlds on merchant vessels and pilgrim ships. It should have been impossible. Kriegers didn't desert. We didn't possess the imagination required to conceive of a life outside Imperial service. But I managed it anyway, driven by the novel and terrifying experience of wanting something for myself, of believing that my life might have value beyond its utility to others. I've been running for 6 years now. I've seen dozens of worlds, worked hundreds of jobs, lived among people who have no idea what I am or where I came from. I've learned to smile, to joke, to fake the emotional responses that normal humans display. I've become skilled at pretending to be something other than a broken weapon repurposed into a failed spy. But I can't stop remembering. I remember Varkus Prime. I remember the 87 survivors of the 117th Cadian who were immediately transferred to a penal legion and sent to die in frontal assaults on Orc positions because they had been exposed to chaos corruption and could never be trusted again. I remember watching Commissar Kraus put a gun under his chin and pull the trigger. I remember realizing that everything I had ever been taught about the Imperium's nobility was propaganda designed to make atrocity acceptable. And I remember what I saw in the archives before I fled. I hacked into Officio Perfectus databases, accessed files I was never meant to read, and discovered that Varkus Prime was not an isolated incident. The Imperium does this constantly. They send regiments to worlds already lost to chaos, not to reclaim them, but to study how quickly corruption spreads. They deploy billions of soldiers to wars they know cannot be won, simply to gather tactical data for future campaigns. They sacrifice entire worlds, entire sectors, entire generations of humanity in pursuit of marginal improvements to their strategic doctrines. It's not incompetence. It's not even cruelty in the traditional sense. It's just mathematics taken to its logical extreme. When you control 1 million worlds and can produce soldiers in virtually unlimited quantities, individual lives stop having meaning. Deaths are just numbers in reports. Suffering is just data to be analyzed. And the whole monstrous edifice continues to function because everyone involved has been conditioned to believe that this is normal, that this is necessary, that this is the only way humanity can survive. They're probably right. That's the worst part. The Imperium is monstrous and evil and built on oceans of blood. But it might actually be necessary. The galaxy is hostile beyond anything most people can comprehend. Chaos is real. The Xenos threats are real. Humanity might genuinely require this level of authoritarian control and systematic atrocity just to avoid extinction. But knowing something is necessary doesn't make it good, doesn't make it holy, doesn't transform suffering into sacrament. I'm tired. I've been tired for years now. The augmentations that were supposed to let me survive on minimal resources are breaking down. The metabolic modifications are failing, and my body is consuming itself trying to maintain the artificial balance. I'm dying slowly, organ by organ, system by system. I probably have another year, maybe 2 if I'm unlucky. I could turn myself in, report to the nearest commissariat office, confess my desertion, accept the execution I richly deserve. It would be easier. It would be faster. And some part of me, some remaining fragment of Krieger conditioning, insists that it would be right, that I owe the Imperium this final service, this last demonstration of loyalty. But I won't, because I've decided that my life belongs to me, not to the Emperor, not to the Officio Perfectus, not to humanity's survival. To me, it's a small rebellion, a meaningless gesture in the face of the Imperium's incomprehensible scale. But it's mine. I'm writing this in a data cafe on some forgettable merchant station orbiting a star whose name I've never learned. When I'm finished, I'll encrypt it and hide it in a dozen different data caches scattered across the network. Maybe someone will find it someday. Maybe they'll read about a Krieger who learned to doubt, who discovered that the God Emperor was just a man, who realized that faith and service and sacrifice were beautiful words used to disguise machinery that ground human beings into paste and called it holy. Or maybe no one will ever read this. Maybe it will sit in some corrupted data vault until the heat death of the universe, a testimony that meant nothing and changed nothing. It doesn't matter. I'm not writing this to change the Imperium. I'm writing it because I need to prove to myself that I existed as something other than a tool, that I was capable of thought and choice and rebellion, even if those thoughts led nowhere and those choices changed nothing, and that rebellion was so small and pathetic that the Imperium never even noticed it. My name was Krieger 5743, Delta 88. I was bred to die for the Emperor without question or hesitation. I was augmented and trained and deployed to document the suffering of those around me and render that suffering into useful data. But I learned to doubt. I learned to question. I learned to see the Imperium for what it truly is. And I learned that I would rather die alone, anonymous, meaningless, but free, than live forever as a component in a machine that processes human souls and calls it divine purpose. That's my testimony. That's my rebellion. That's all I have to offer to whatever future might exist beyond the Imperium's eventual collapse. Remember that we existed. Remember that we suffered. Remember that some of us, however briefly, chose something other than obedience. Even if it meant nothing. Even if it changed nothing. Even if the only witness to our defiance was the empty void between stars. We were here. We thought. We chose. We were human, for whatever that's worth in a galaxy that has forgotten what humanity means.